So, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to our first IPRA Thought Leadership webinar after the summer in the Northern Hemisphere. And today I'm delighted to welcome Gerry McCusker from Melbourne, Australia. Gerry is going to talk to us about Express Crisis Management, the 1-hour diagnostic. He's an expert in crisis management training. He's been an issues management specialist for years, and is also an author. There's a book he wrote called PR Disasters. He writes a regular blog on crisis management and public relations also. Gerry will talk for about half an hour, 40 minutes, and then we will field questions. You can place questions anytime you want in the Q&A tab, which you'll see to the left of the chat tab on your screen now. And I will field those to Gerry once we've done. I will leave the screen while he's speaking. If you're on a small device and you want to see the slides clearer, you'll find there's an option toward the top of the screen whereby you can see slides only by pressing on the full screen icon, which is the box with 4 small arrows into it. So I shall leave you now in the hands of Gerry McCusker. Gerry.
Thank you very much, Philip. And I have to say good evening to you all, given that I'm based down here in Melbourne, Victoria. A little bit of a puzzler for you just as I start this. My first slide is entitled Crisis Management Audit Diagnostic. It might seem a bit of a confusing title, but that's because I need a little bit of input from you. We developed this tool, which is an Express kind of an analysis tool for organizations. And I was very sure that what I developed was a really nifty audit. However, when we told clients about what we had developed, we spoke to a couple of clients about what we were working on. We got a little bit of a cold response to the idea of being audited for crisis. And we then tried this little soft sell where we said, if we change it to diagnostic, is the reception likely to be any better? And to be honest, it's only anecdotal at the moment, but our feeling is that the client companies that we're speaking to relate better to the idea of a crisis management diagnostic rather than a crisis management audit. Audit's a much better word, and we think it's actually what we're doing. But I'd love to hear any of your feedback if you think audit sounds too harsh or in your territory. The word audit is a good thing or a bad thing. It has negative connotations. As I say, we had a little bit of feedback. People seemed to take a step back when they thought they were going to be audited, and hence why I've put in diagnostic, because I'd love to get some feedback from you about how you think we should label this thing. But anyway, on with the show. So in putting together this analysis tool, or this kind of stock taking inventory piece, this is part of the offer is part of our drill crisis simulation platform. It's a fully interactive digital crisis simulation portal where basically we log the delegates in and they encounter the types of pressures that they're going to face in a crisis situation. However, it seemed to us, in a lot of the stuff that we're doing, a lot of organizations are not thinking about crisis as a concept and crisis management as a strategic discipline. And we thought, what can we do to support that? Hence why we've developed this tool, which is part of our drill offering. So what we thought that we were seeing in the market was a bit of a problem. So the problem being, as far as we can make out, and maybe it's just the companies and government agencies that we're speaking to, is we've trained and taught thousands of people, ran hundreds of SIMs and training events and consultation sessions. We spoke about the leading principles and the key tenets of primarily issues management and then crisis management handling practices. We've listened and consulted with multiple disciplines. We've been brought in sometimes by corporate affairs people. We've other times been brought in by human resources practitioners. We've sometimes been brought in by operational or risk management specialists across a number of different organizations and industries. And the reality is that precious few see crisis in exactly the same way. And I think this is a real problem when it comes to issues management, which is primarily what we like to be involved in, because if we can be involved in issues management, then hopefully we can avoid having to become involved in crisis management. I know that's not a universal statement, but it's a principle. It's what we're aiming for. So the problem is that too few people see crisis in exactly the same way. So when we've got them within our live interaction portal, the drill, we've got a number of different modalities that we use to train organizations in this. Sometimes we do everybody in a central war room. Sometimes we do hybrid sessions where we've got perhaps the main crisis response team in one room and delegates dialing in from remote locations, pretty much indicative of how a lot of us are working nowadays. And then we've got the other option, which is completely remote, and we can run these simulations pretty much without MD being in the same room as us. Now, it's great to have that flexibility, but we're still sorry, I've just seen the poll question, and I have to say, I have to vote for the one I'm going to vote for. I'm just seeing how I can advance my slides here, because that poll has actually covered it up temporarily. So when I talk about problem, I actually think that what we're looking at is a bias problem. And this is the thing I think we're trying to overcome with the crisis simulation audit, the crisis simulation diagnostic. Is the bias problem that we're observing is that boards see board-related problems, comms see comms problems, finance, it's about money, HR sees people problems, yada, 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 and of course sales see getting a new Tesla problem. And it's not just that, but we've observed when we're running the crisis simulations, mid-crisis, many practitioners revert to their silo bias. So they revert to thinking about the issue in terms of the discipline that they favour as individual practitioners. And this makes them revert to type in some ways. So the problems that we're trying to look at is that you've got lots and lots of people who approach and see crisis in quite different ways as individuals. And then when they're in mid-crisis, they tend to default to the bias of the discipline that they represent in the simulation. For example, we recently ran a crisis simulation, which was about a cyber attack. We actually wove in a sub-narrative of racial discrimination relating to the attack. And a senior member of the client team brushed that aside as a distraction. Now, it's interesting because in terms of the actual crisis that was impacting upon this organization in our scenario, it was a little bit of a distraction, but that's not to say that it wouldn't get massive reputational and media traction. So again, this person was able to dismiss that because the issue that it raised about staff welfare, staff discrimination, and racial bias actually wasn't part of their wheelhouse. So we've got a couple of problems that we're looking to try and intercept and fix with our analysis tool. So the agenda today, I can perhaps skip past this. I'm going to talk to you about what I see as problems, our insight, what we're trying to do, how we might want to standardize some of the skill sets involved in crisis management, because I think it's a great leveler. I'll show you some sample questions from the audit and like to get your feedback and before we wrap it up. So our kind of methodological insight for this, given what we're facing, lots of people seeing crisis in quite unique ways, lots of people, when they're in the middle of a crisis, diverting to their maybe initial or dominant disciplinary training or background. So we're crisis tech providers. That's what the drill is. It's a simulation portal. And we know that there are a set of credential standards out there. So how do we bring this together to meet client needs? So our insight is that, well, what if we leaned on the qualifications that are advocated for effective crisis management practice, we borrow them, we think we can better them or improve them or inform them. So we run these crisis audits or crisis diagnostics in line with the recognised qualification standards for crisis practice here in Australia. Now, some of you will be saying, I'm not in Australia, this might not apply to me. Well, forgive me for a second. You would surely acknowledge that in Australia, we know a thing or two about crisis and about crisis management. Whether it's floods in northern New South Wales, whether it's bushfires in South Australia, Victoria, we're pretty au fait with what crises are. So just bear with me if you can accept that these standards might be an interesting one for you to look at. So with this idea, what if we run audits to the recognised qualification standards for practice? So what we do is that we then can put all of the client organisations and all of the disciplines who are represented into the same box. So this gets over the problem of, well, I see it this way and this is what's important to me. And then when the stuff hits the fan, reverting to type, if we put them into this box, then it's a great leveler and they can all begin to understand how there are many different dynamics, but these are the capabilities that we need to align to and adhere to. So what we did was we referenced the Australian Skills Quality Authority requirements for crisis management good practice. We added a little bit of our own drill special sauce. So we're benchmarking against the best practice standards. It's not some highfalutin theory. It's not reinventing the wheel. It's just functional, operational, good, solid practice for crisis management. So what we're doing is we shadow the requirements, but we don't hand out medals or qualifications because we're not authorised to do that. But what we then have developed is effectively when clients take the analysis or the questionnaire, it becomes a co-owned piece of literature. We test them on the key crisis requirements so we can gauge their capability and their vulnerability at the same time. We guide them through that process. And of course, after they're done, whether they've come out with flying colours, we can test it live in the drill that they've already taken the questionnaire in. And if they've got vulnerabilities, we can show up those vulnerabilities again in the simulations that we run. So hopefully this is kind of making sense. You're going, all right, this is an interesting approach. So this isn't, and the other great thing for us, even if the clients don't enjoy the process that we take them through, they're really railing against the mandated or advised standards that they need to come up to rather than the word of some egomaniacal consultant. So when it comes to the audit elements, we broke the questionnaire down into 4 sections. Very simple, straightforward stuff for issues in crisis management. Pre-planning, situation assessment, communications, and post-incident. So clearly, you can see even from those 4 sections, the audit scope is going to be multidisciplinary. So it's not going to be about my bias as a communicator. Yes, I might have some more juice or energy around the communications section of the audit, but clearly it's multidisciplinary. And we think that this is really good because it involves their entire team in making decisions and assessing the aptitudes that they need to have. So a little bit of a qualification. I want to re-emphasize that we reckon the audit is about 75% comprised of and informed by the ASCO mandates for crisis management skills proficiency. However, it also has about 24% of insights from us being, we've done this stuff. We've managed issues and crises live. So we know from a practical point of view, well, this is not something you'll read in an MBA. This is not something you'll see in a school qualification or a university qualification. But by synthesizing these 2 forms of learning, we think that the audit works at a theoretical and a practical level. And of course, because we're mature and egoless practitioners, we'll allow our audit to evolve as the crisis landscape and best practice methods and models are presented and developed. And also as clients mature and change and their risk landscape changes too, we'll allow a little bit of 1% wiggle room to try and change up the actual plan. So I'm not saying that this is going to work for absolutely every scenario and absolutely every industry, But what it will do is it will help to hold organisations to account to make sure that their skill sets and practices and processes are aligned to what's recommended by the ASCO authorities and by us as frontline practitioners. So with that being said, let me share what some of the sections and questions look like. The first phase is pre-planning. And I wanted to write up a little bit of a synopsis about each of these sections, because essentially in this whole umbrella of the pre-planning questions, we're looking to determine how collaborative and social the organisation is before the crisis takes place. And we're talking about their collaboration and sociability regarding documents, preparation, roles and responsibility, and stakeholder focus, not self-focus and self-interest. How we're trying to get them to think more clearly about their place within an internal crisis response team, but also within a wider ecosystem of multifaceted stakeholder groups who may be involved should the crisis reach its peak. So again, the pre-planning stuff is looking to try and socialise some of the knowledge and to make sure that as many different stakeholders are involved as need to be to develop a healthy, robust and workable plan. As I say, we've fully digitised this document. We built it into an online questionnaire. And so just to give you a bit of a flavour, the first question says, do you have monitoring and scenario scanning tools in place? And are they actively used for identifying possible issues, threats and risks? Now this might, maybe for a lot of us in this forum, it might seem like, well, this is absolutely basic stuff, right? But you know, if we don't ask the question and tease it out of the organisation that we're advising or consulting to, then there's a chance that some of that bias that I talked about from earlier, or some of that supposition stuff, actually is what makes the decisions. For example, we ran a simulation a couple of weeks ago for a company in the tech sector. And they had media monitoring tools in place, but the way that we designed the crisis simulation for them, the earliest intel that there was a problem emerged on social media channels. And I think it's fair to say that the idea of having social media monitoring isn't a revolutionary one, but the time at which we injected that piece of the narrative into the crisis scenario, nobody at the organisation would have been looking at the monitoring systems. And in fact, pretty much from 6 p.m. on a Friday night to 7 or 8 a.m. on a Monday morning, the organisation had no digital media monitoring systems activated. Not a small business, not a mom and pop operation by any stretch of the imagination, but just hadn't really thought about, do we have the right monitoring and scenario scanning tools in place, and are they actively used? Well, if they're not being looked at, or there's no alert capability to send those in the CMT a heads up over a weekend, you may be risking 2 days for an issue to fester that would have been better off intercepted earlier rather than later. So we will look at some of the other. I'm just going to share a couple of the other. So the second one in terms of our pre-planning would be, do your crisis plans reflect best practice standards for your industry or your entity's risk profile? Again, we're looking to see, are you plugged in well enough to your industry to know what other practitioners are doing? I mean, we know that the aviation industry, for example, we've done some work in that sector. We know the aviation industry are actually quite generous at sharing around risk issues and crisis related documents. And again, it gives you the opportunity to ask the organisation, are you actually benchmarking yourself against what some of the peak practitioners in your field are doing? Or if you're in a industry or a sector which has got a very high risk profile, I think airlines are probably up there. I think anything technological would be in that basket as well. Are you actually making sure that your crisis plans are calibrated against the best and calibrated to be the most robust they can be, given the vulnerability of your sector? And we see here, you've got the opportunity. Clients can say, yes, we know they are. No, they definitely aren't. Or we're a little bit unsure. And I'll show you in subsequent slide what happens when they click any of these buttons, because we've found a way that we can tease out some more information from them. The next question again, are stakeholder groups, internal and external, consulted for their inputs to the crisis plan? Now, I'm not sure how it is in your territory, but here in Australia, I think it would be fair to say that stakeholder groups that are internal to the organisation are often consulted, or most likely to be consulted, but stakeholder groups outside the organisation are less likely to be consulted about their inputs into the crisis plan. And again, it's a really interesting notion presents itself to me here, because isn't this a great time when you're not in crisis, peacetime, not wartime, when you're not in crisis, to reach out to stakeholders who are important and tell them that you're working on developing up your crisis capability and we would like some of your input to what we're doing? Isn't that a wonderful way to build alliances when what you're doing is giving them an opportunity to help you, rather than look to keep them at bay when the balloon goes up? So again, some of this, we talked about the generosity of spirit, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more. So what we're doing is we're trying to tease out, do you do the practices that are mandated or recommended to get you up to a base level of robust operations? And this is a big one for us. So you won't find this in any of the stuff that we're doing, but we're very proud of this idea. It's question 6 of our pre-planning. Is there an avowed and agreed mission for addressing risks, threats, and crisis? And again, we consulted to a tech firm based out of California maybe 12, 14 months ago, and a big organization, multidisciplinary, lots of heads of department. And the exact thing that I'm talking about was presenting in this case. Many different honchos, all of whom saw crisis in very different ways. In fact, they asked us to develop a crisis management plan for them, and we went back with an issues management plan, because they had no formulaic way to devise, are we actually in crisis at the moment, or is this an issue, or is this an inconvenience that we can work through? So what we said, and we've said it before to other clients, what is our mission going to be for this crisis? Because once you set a mission, everybody accepts corporate missions, right? Oh, we've got a corporate vision statement and our mission is going to be this and blah, blah, blah. But we tend to do that less in crisis. A lot of organizations, when a crisis hits, they seem to default to their skill set and figure out, how do we muddy our way through this as best we can? But we're saying, is there an agreed mission that we can all buy into, which guides all of the efforts that we're making in response to this particular set of threats? And I've got to be honest with you, this has been well received by some organizations. It makes a lot of sense. And some organizations feel it's a little bit esoteric or airy-fairy. We don't need a mission for crisis. We need to fix the damn thing. Well, if you all bring your own bias and your own personal worldviews to this, you fixing it can slightly pull in different directions. But if we agree a mission for crisis and you all buy into that, then everything that we do must be pushing in that direction. And for us as practitioners, crisis management is a directional discipline. It's a directional discipline. So the next section that we look at is obviously our situation assessment. And here, generally speaking, the questions relate to the extent and the degree of generosity which the organisation possesses. So I guess a little bit of our input here is, if organisations are able to be other-centred when they're under attack. So not self-centered, because that's not an instinctive move to be thinking about other people when you're under attack. And I think that some of us who have worked in this field for a long time would observe that organizations who are under a severe or sustained attack, they tend to tense up and they tend to get a little bit defensive in the way that they want to respond to that. And there's lots of tension between the different advisors. We can't say that, we shouldn't do that, and things get bogged down in that tightness. It's the generosity that helps you walk through this with a little bit more capability and a little bit more goodwill. So we think that other-centeredness through the questionnaire can be flagged and nurtured and eventually prioritized. And obviously generosity has a monetary dynamic, which we also talk to our clients about when we're running this audit. Some of the sample questions that we've got here. Does your crisis plan include incident-specific monitoring for intelligence? So people thinking that their monitoring tool is only about brand or reputation tracking. We're actually saying, do you use your monitoring and do you recalibrate your monitoring for intel when you're doing your situation analysis? Again, our experience is that a lot of clients do the monitoring so that they get an initial heads up that their brand was mentioned or their executives were mentioned or the project was in trouble, but then not recalibrating the monitoring to actually give them the intel to help respond to this in a generous, open-hearted, positive way. And you can see here just a little bit the functionality of this. If a client or a participant delegate ticks the don't know box, then a box comes up below. Do you have any further comments about it? And especially if a client says that they don't know. So if a client says, yes, we do that, fantastic. If a client says, no, we don't do that, it's also interesting. It's a good data point that we can look at later. If a client says, don't know, there's an uncertainty in their answer there. And living with that uncertainty is likely not as productive as the client then going a stage further and saying, well, you know, we actually don't share our monitoring after an incident, or, you know, whatever it might be. So we're looking to help them tease out what might be vulnerabilities in their capability. Again, some of the other questions. Do you methodologically assess the implications and impacts of issues and risk, both on affected stakeholders and on the company? A lot of organizations do think, how's this going to affect us? How's it going to affect operations? What's it going to do to that campaign we're running just now? Or what's it going to do to our premises? What's it going to do to our people? But when you're thinking, are you doing it just as forensically for the affected stakeholders? And again, if an organization says, absolutely, we do that, then it's a big win. But we ask the question so that we can get them all to think about this and honestly respond to it. Again, does your crisis strategy have a pre-allocated budget for any necessary harm minimization or to buy in additional resource expenditures? Some of the organizations that we've consulted with and advised would say that their finance director is not part of the crisis response team. And in fact, when we've run simulations which called for monetary additional resources to be released, they say, well, we would need to contact finance to get clearance to do that. Probably not an ideal situation. Other organizations we've spoken with, they say, budget's not a problem for us. There is a way, there is a conduit and a channel for us to tap into extra budget. So fantastic. The communication, you know, whether it's the horrible Hawaiian wildfires that we saw a couple of weeks ago to devastating floods in New South Wales and Australia, poor communications is often flagged as a key problem in crisis management. So the monitoring helps you do the effective listening if you do the right kind of monitoring, right? But processes and templates can be streamlined well in advance of the event, and certainly so that you don't waste time when deadlines for comms are become really tightly pinched, okay? So we ask clients about their media, the media channel strategies, as well as the kind of crisis messages. And a lot of you will have worked on template messages as well. But again, it's good to talk about these issues, not just to comms practitioners, but so that the board can see that there's work to be done in here, so that operations understand that they've got to feed good intel which inform crisis communications. Like we say, crisis comms is only really as good as the decision making that is made by other practitioners. So we bring them into this tent of trust, and we ask them, we show them the kind of things that we prosecute when it comes to communication. So a fairly basic one for the communications section of the audit. Do you activate or attend a dedicated crisis war room or nominated command and control facility when crisis hits? Now, we had a great response from a client who did it. In fact, our most recent one, they actually said you're sitting in it, which was quite refreshing. So the actual room that we took them through the audit in was their crisis command centre. It maybe wasn't particularly obvious, but that's nonetheless, they said, oh, this is it. Other organisations would say that it would definitely be a hybrid situation. We did another simulation with an education institution here in Australia, and as we were running the simulation, somebody said, but in actual fact, if this were a real crisis, we would be in the crisis war room. And quite a few of the disciplinary representatives said, oh, we've got a specialist war room for this kind of stuff. And again, a puzzling one for us, that we're running a simulation, but the client chose not to run it in the actual command and control centre that they would use in the event of a real crisis. Some of the other feedback in that session has just come to mind is that depending on what was happening on any given day, at least 60% of us would be working remotely. So we would need to find a way to do this in a kind of hybrid collection. Again, it's not that you couldn't do it. It's not to say that one mode is better than another mode, but it's good to know it, and it's good to document it, and it's good to make sure that everybody else knows what it's going to look like when the stuff hits the fan. Some of the other things that we're interested in are regular comms with appropriate stakeholders, including staff, customers, and regulatory networks, listed as a documented priority. Again, client says, don't know. We've got a little box. Do you have any further comments? And then some examples. It depends on the circumstances. Just ways in which the form can help us tease out client intel and client response. Is the monitoring of restoration tactics and tailoring of custom crisis message accommodated within and communicated out via your current crisis plans? Tends to be, I would have to say, just anecdotally, not really. Pretty much the comms is legislated for as long as we're in peak crisis mode or in the run up to averting crisis. But then when it's peak crisis mode, we will be communicating. But once the crisis peak has passed, communications around restoration tactics tends to get a little bit less intensive. And again, it's probably not the ideal practice if organizations default to that. Wow, we got through the big part of the crisis, we can take it easier again, right? Probably not. Again, these are just some of the questions that we're pulling up here. And the post-incident phase, all of my pictures here are all of therapeutic recovery, but it was the best I could do. But it's this, we get the into this is when you're being, we're into recovery mode. We're able to provide a little bit more personal assistance. We ask the organisations, the crisis end when the worst day is over. The life cycle of any emergency event lasts way longer than its media exposure. Remediation work extends way beyond disaster time. I mean, I tend to forget about horrible disasters that I see on TV because a new one replaces it. The terrible tragedy that we're seeing, the earthquakes in Morocco, the devastating floods in Libya. It's terrible, the attention span for all of us who watch and consume media. Oh, there's another disaster. But the recovery from that stuff goes on and on for years. And the communications and the stakeholder engagement should go on to accompany that recovery phase. So not only is there going to be a reallocation of efforts, expertise and resources, but we really need to keep telling that story of how we're doing that. And of course, we as we get towards the end of this, we ask clients who's going to guide and who's going to lead the reusing of what lessons that we learned from the activities that we were engaged in. Now, I can see there's a couple of questions popping up in the feed, but I'll try and get to the end of the presentation so that I make the appropriate amount of time for the Q&A at the end, if you'll allow me to do that. Thanks. So when it comes to the post-incident, we're asking, does the crisis plan support the activation of a post-incident recovery activity plan? Again, whether it's done or not, we have to bring this to the surface, because this is what's mandated as being effective and robust practice according to the ASQA standards, which we think are pretty useful. They're informative. They may be not perfect, but they're really quite useful. And some of the other questions that we'll be asking, see, I'm dotting around some of the questions in order to give you a little bit of a flavour. Is the effectiveness and the compliance of the incident response efforts assessed and critiqued internally as well as by independent external advisors? Now, I don't know what it's like in your experience, but I'd love to hear in the chat box there. Many organisations would, depending on the nature of the business that they're in or the sector that they operate in, they would assess and critique the effectiveness of the response internally, but not always by independent external auditors if it's not mandated. And again, I can understand why organisations maybe don't want to open the doors and put themselves under scrutiny, but transparency is a wonderful lotion. You know, transparency and openness and that generosity of help us figure out what we can do better for our stakeholders. And we're going to put a set of independent eyes on this. That's a good question to ask organisations. Are you willing to do that kind of stuff? So let's say we've been running this audit and it's been running for all of these clients, and it kind of comes up to the last question, question 10 of 10 in the post-incident phase. We're asking, in summary, how would you describe your current crisis plans and capabilities? Now, this is the ideal time to ask this question, because you've got an organisation. If they take the audit, they've actually thought about many of the different dynamics and components, capabilities, attitudes, action plans. They've been thinking about this solidly for about 40, 45 minutes at this stage. So when we ask, how would you describe your current crisis plans and capabilities? If they've answered everything supremely well, they can say, superb, we're in really good shape. And that's a great win. What a lovely form of reassurance for an organisation to be able to say, hey, we did the drill crisis diagnostic and we're in really, really good nick. There are some who might say, well, you know, we said don't know quite a few times, so it might be less certain. It might be, maybe it's adequate. And I think for clients who are answering a lot of in the no's and they don't really have the capabilities, then we would say that their crisis plans and capabilities are really non-existent. And we don't want it to get to that stage, but again, it's a moment of glory as well, because if a client does come to the end of this and says, you know, we're in bad shape, well, again, it's just as happy day as it is, or we're in great shape. If the client's in great shape, say, fantastic. You should still phone us and do a simulation now and again, but at least you know you're in good shape according to the prescribed educational standards of capability for crisis management and crisis response. If they're in bad shape, it's good to know it, right? Because you won't be smashed if you fix the problems that we've identified across the 4 sections. So that's basically how it kind of works. So basically what I'm saying in conclusion is we've developed this as an online questionnaire. We can deliver a punchy, informed inventory in under an hour. It's informed by ASQA, the Australian Skills Quality Authority. It's not authorised by them. We're just looking at the standards that they set out and figure, how do we shadow that? And how can we make it a little bit better as we see it in our experience as frontline practitioners? It focuses the mind and it audits the practice. It's a directional evaluator designed to improve capability, where processes and roles are reviewed and refined, and a generous and holistic attitude is instilled so that your crisis responses are purposeful, prepared, and prescribed. You can see I enjoyed writing this piece. I was getting into the creative flow by this stage. So that's kind of like, how long have I been talking for? I've been talking for 40 minutes, so I think it's time to go over to you. I would just, in wrapping up, I want to thank, before I forget at the end, I want to thank Philip and IPRA for allowing me the platform to speak to you lovely people. And if you do want to reach out to myself or my colleague George, who's based in Kuala Lumpur, we'd be happy to speak to you. But Philip, maybe you can share some of the brickbats and bouquets that have been shared in the convo stream.
I will indeed, Gerry. Thank you very much for that. That was beautifully timed and very clear as well.
Would you like me to stop presenting, Philip?
No, it's fine. Just you can stay it is. We can keep that on screen for people. That's helpful. I've just got a definitional question first of my own before we get down to any others. And you mentioned the phrase quite often, risks, threats, and crises. And I wondered if that's because there's a sliding scale from potential to actual. Is that the case?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is. Philip, I would say just more simply than that, I'll share what we've actually worked on. The thing that we find really useful to help organisations think about crisis management in a sort of scaled way. I do mention issues, risks, threats, and crises, but the thing that we help to categorise are inconveniences, issues, and crisis. It's just a 3-step thing. So for some organisations, they face a set of circumstances, and if they don't know that it's actually just an inconvenience, it can, depending on what's going on in any given day, it can actually feel like an issue verging on a crisis. But when you take time to run a matrix over it, a pain and consequence matrix we use, you find it's an inconvenience. However, we think that issues tend to be a little bit more meaty than that, impact upon maybe 2 or more divisions of a company, and crisis is a different category of its own.
Lovely, thank you for that. So we have a question from Syed Idib from Malaysia, who's running his own organization, I believe. His question is a 24/7 social media team important for crisis preparedness, in particular when it comes to monitoring? And if yes, what sort of size should that team be?
It's hard to give look, my instinct says no. I don't think it is. No, I don't think a 24/7 social media monitoring team is essential. But there has to be a caveat with that. It would depend on the nature of the business, the status of a project, and the level of contention or potential pain and consequence that could arise from a key phase in business operations. So, for example, you wouldn't need 24/7 social media monitoring 365 days a year. I don't think, most organizations that I've consulted to might not actually need that. I personally have used hybrid media monitoring alerts notifications, and I've found them usually reliable enough for the work that I'm doing. But I don't think you need 24/7, 365. I think it can be managed by having the right monitoring. But really, as I said during the presentation, Philip, as well, and Syed, it's about knowing how to configure your monitoring system to give you the intel that is likely to be of use. Like, there would be no point in having a monitoring system that woke you up at 3 o'clock on a Saturday morning or 3 o'clock on a Sunday morning or a Friday morning if it was just to tell you your brand had been mentioned on TikTok. However, if it was configured to let's say we were launching the the New Wall campaign. We were launching the New Wall campaign, and it was a critical phase of that launch. You might want to have amped up the detail in your monitoring to give you the intel if this was mentioned, that was mentioned in relation to the launch of the Wall campaign. So I don't think it's about having a hive full of social media watchers. I think it's about configuring the monitoring technologies that are available to us in the right ways.
Lovely, thank you for that. So I have a question from Alistair Smith, who's a Communications Corporate Affairs Director of Linlaters in the UK. Over the years, we've seen an inability for organisations to recognise that something is a crisis, particularly if that's around people or behaviour. Is there a way to test or triage that sort of thing?
Alistair, I mentioned it. I've mentioned that a couple of times. I don't think I've got a slide on it, but we use this terminology. Like, as I say, what we try to categorise or help organisations categorise: is this an inconvenience? Is this an issue? Or is this a crisis? And the thing that we use as the determinant of which box it falls into is a pain and consequence matrix. So we recently did a crisis comms strategy for an infrastructure agency, and we put the pain and consequence matrix on top of some of the factors that they had in their risk management plan. So the pain is the immediate pinch of the incident, but the consequence are like the rip. So the pain is like the pebble in the pond; it smacks the water, but the consequence are the ripples that come out from the pebble. And depending on how long those ripples are going to go out on for, then you get a sense of, actually, we can see this is going to be quite big and reverberate for quite a long time. So the thing that we use, the tool that we use, Alistair, is the pain and consequence matrix, because and it's interesting, Alistair, you're making me think of as I said, this simulation that we did recently that I shared. The client dismissed the racial vilification of staff members around a cyber hack as a piddling issue and wanted to discount it. However, what you might discount operationally might play really big reputationally and might play globally in terms of reputation, depending where the staff are from. But when you run a pain and consequence matrix over the top of it, I think it gives you a sharper insight so that you know exactly what you're dealing with when you see it.
Really, thank you for that. So a question from Nigeria, from Tosin Adefeko, who I recognise as being one of the winners of the IPRA Golden World Awards this year. So congratulations to you, Tosin, and we're looking forward to seeing you at our ceremony in Barcelona. And Tosin is asking, what is the best way to measure the outcomes of a crisis management process? The outcomes.
Wow. Sorry, can you say again, what is the best way, or some of them?
What's the best way to measure the outcomes of a crisis management process?
Best way to measure the outcomes? You know, really, I think that's a fantastically difficult question for me. I think, for me, given the spirit of the presentation that I've just given, I think it has to be the level of approval or acceptance that you get from the key affected stakeholders. I know that's a little bit. I know many organisations will say, "Well, hold on, we protected our brand, we retained the job of 22,000 employees, we didn't see turnover or sales fall off a cliff." I think, from my view as a crisis management practitioner and a reputation watcher, I think if you get the acceptance and approbation of the key affected stakeholders, and maybe they don't love you as they're experiencing the discomfort of the pain and consequences, but they're willing to accept that your organization or your agency is doing the best that they can amid a set of difficult circumstances, which isn't completely focused and on self-preservation and self-serving. I think that would be a fine hallmark to judge a crisis campaign on.
Very good, thank you. Another question of my own. Does the process that you describe scale from small organisations to very large ones, or is there perhaps a certain size of organisation it's better suited for?
You know, I think, Philip, because as I say, what we've tried to do with this diagnostic is we've tried to anchor it in the kind of like the key performative skills that are required by the ASQA Skills Quality Authority in Australia. So they're not saying, hey, you know, only this organisation or this big company can use this. These are sort of fundamental practices. And by the way, they're not for the comparable rocket scientists of our field. The qualifications that they're talking about are pretty much functional operating standards and principles. So whether it is a mom and pop organization now whether mom and pop organizations have got the resources to invest in all of these capabilities is a bigger, but that's a management question. That's a resources question. But I think the principles that are at play, because they're, as I said, about 75% informed by ASQA, I think they're universally applicable. I really do. And that's not to say I just generally think, well, this isn't even me trying to target the kind of ideal model for us, you know, the ideal clients to suit our business model. This is me saying, well, hold on. If these are set out as functional requirements for we're able to do crisis management professionally and effectively, then absolutely for small organizations, small to medium-sized and large corporations, they should work.
Yes. Thank you for that.
Yep.
And another question from our friend Saeed Idid in Malaysia. Many CEOs believe that with a risk management assessment framework in place, it's sufficient to just face the crisis. Have you found that's the case? And what would you recommend?
Yes, a really interesting dance, Syed, that you've just, it's a great point, actually. I would have to counter and say to a CEO or anybody who held their risk management framework up and say, this document is not the same as a crisis management or a crisis response plan. It's not the same thing. It's just like my job title and my responsibilities are not the same responsibilities that I might have when I'm actually in crisis mode. They change. The risk management plan, I'm not saying we discount it. So recently we were almost held, we had to make sure that our crisis strategy aligned closely enough with the master risk management plan that an organization had. But I have to be honest, that risk management plan was actually authored in 2020, and we're now coming towards the end of 2023. However, we had to make sure that it referenced some of the threats. Incidentally, not really knowing the client's business intimately, we added two very clear and present threats that they hadn't even considered, but they're very realistic for that organization, for any organization. So the risk management plan might give a CEO a level of warmth or reassurance that, hey, we've got this. But that's kind of going to tell you, that's often going to tell you, depending on the nature of that plan, this is going to tell you, this is what we're looking out for. But when the stuff hits the fan, it presents a new set of challenges, and they're not always catered to in the risk management plan. But the crisis response plan has already thought about potential eventualities that will arise in the crisis, and that's a much sharper document to give you a plan of attack or a plan of recourse to help troubleshoot, navigate, ameliorate and mitigate the problems that are arising. But it's a fantastic point to bring up, the tension between the organizational risk management document and the actual crisis response plan. Two quite different documents in my estimation.
Sure. Lovely. Well, I think that concludes our session for today and the questions in front of us. So, Gerry, I'd like to thank you very much for presenting to the audience. Thank you for listening and your questions. You've had the information on screen there if you want to contact Gerry directly with further inquiries. And I look forward to seeing you next month, the 12th of October, when Christine Moore will be talking to us about diversity in public relations. So until then, Goodbye, and thank you very much.
Thank you to you, Philip. Great session. Thanks.
Bye-bye.